The NBA wasn't always the slam dunking, sneaker crazy spectacle it is today. It actually started way back in 1946. But basketball itself is way older. It was invented by this guy named James Naismith back in the late 1800s. He was looking for a cool indoor sport for his gym class, so he came up with this game where you try to toss a soccer ball into peach baskets. Yup, it's pretty wild if you think about it. Think about this. Back in the late 1800s, gyms weren't fancy like they are today. It was basically just a big room with some basic equipment. James Naismith was a physical education teacher in Massachusetts, and he was trying to keep his students active during the cold winter months. They couldn't exactly play baseball or soccer indoors, right? So he gets this idea to nail some old peach baskets to the gym walls, gives the students a soccer ball and says, "Alright, try to get the ball in there." The students had to figure out how to bounce the ball, how to pass it to each other, and eventually some brave soul probably tried the first ever jump shot. Can you imagine that? It's basically basketball's version of the Wright brothers movement. You can say this is where basketball finally took flight. Naismith wasn't just looking for something to keep his students busy. He wanted a game that would teach teamwork and sportsmanship. Basketball was supposed to be a way for them to let loose and have fun, but also to learn how to work together and play fair. The NBA wasn't always the NBA. It actually began its life as a Basketball Association of America in 1946. It was a different time for basketball then. There were only 11 teams and things were a lot rougher than they are now. It was during this crazy time that BAA decided to merge with the National Basketball League and form the NBA we know today. When you think about the NBA, you probably don't picture bombs bursting in the air or soldiers fighting in a far-off land. You might not expect it, but the Korean War actually had a pretty big impact on the NBA. Stars like Paul Arizin and Bill Sherman had to put their basketball careers on hold to serve their country. When they came back, they were seen as heroes. It boosted the NBA's image and showed that these guys were more than just athletes, they were patriots too. The US military played a huge role in popularizing basketball across Asia. They introduced the game to local populations and it quickly caught on. Soldiers would set up makeshift courts and play against each other and the locals. It was a great way to connect with the communities they were stationed in. Even though the NBA's global expansion came decades later, those early seeds planted by the military laid the foundations for basketball's massive popularity in Asia today. The early years of the NBA were pretty wild. Teams would literally fight each other on the court, and some rules we think of as normal now didn't even exist. The three-pointer shot wasn't a thing. Every shot was worth 2 points, and no matter how far out you were.
2 seconds, 1 second, West throws it up.
They figured if you're that far away, you might as well pass it to someone closer. And another thing, it was traveling. Back then, players were allowed to take a few steps with the ball before they had to dribble or pass. It led to some pretty awkward looking moves by today's standards. It wasn't uncommon for teams to try and stretch out leads by intentionally fouling their opponents. Seems like Hack-a-Shaq existed even back in the 1950s. That way, the other team had to keep shooting free throws and it slowed down the pace of the game. Also, the draft lottery didn't exist. Back then, teams would literally draw straws. Like literally, they were drawing straws to see who got the first pick. That made things pretty unpredictable. Some of the biggest legends to come out of that era include guys like George Mikan, who's considered by many to be the first superstar center. Wilt Chamberlain, another legendary center who broke tons of scoring records. And then there's Bill Russell, who's widely regarded as one of the greatest winners and defenders ever. The NBA back then was a different world. Even the biggest stars weren't swimming in cash like today's players. You had guys who were incredible on the court, but off the court they had to hustle just to make ends meet. Guys like George Mikan, who's considered one of the all-time greats, He worked as a physical education teacher in the off-season, and it wasn't just the stars. A lot of players had to take whatever odd jobs they could find, selling insurance, driving trucks, that kind of thing, just to get by. Another thing, injuries were a nightmare. Like I said, the way the game was played back then, it was brutal. Guys were getting elbowed in the face, hacked on the arms. It was crazy. And the equipment man, well, he wasn't even close to what they have now. No fancy mouth guards or padded uniforms. So when you got injured, you were really injured. There's tons of stories about guys playing through injuries that would sideline today's players for months. You all know who we are talking about. It was a different mentality though. If you wanted to keep your sport, you had to gut it out. And the trainers back then, while they tried their best, they didn't have all the fancy medicine and rehab methods we have today. It was basically aspirin, tape and hope for the best. Spencer Haywood was a beast and he played through a lot of pain. Another guy was Rick Barry. He played with a broken hand at one point. Can you believe that? But it wasn't just about being tough. Some guys had career-ending injuries and there wasn't much of a safety net back then. It was survival of the fittest and it made the game even more of a spectacle. Willis Reed's story in the 1970 NBA Finals is a stuff of legends. He was the heart and soul of the New York Knicks, but he went into Game 7 absolutely wrecked with a bad leg injury. Everyone thought there was no way he'd play, but then just before tip-off, he comes limping out of the tunnel. The crowd goes wild.
Coming out. There he comes right now. 6'10" from Grambling.
And he somehow manages to lead the Knicks to victory. It was one of the most iconic moments in NBA history, and it really shows you the kind of toughness and determination these old school players had. And it wasn't just about the physical side. The mental stress on these guys was enormous. The players were under constant pressure to perform. Every game was a battle, and there weren't really any outlets to relieve that stress like players have today. Back then, guys had to deal with way more racism and disrespect. There'd be stuff written in the papers, things fans would yell at them. It was pretty ugly at times. They had to develop thick skin just to survive, and let's not forget the pressure to be role models. These guys were looked up to by kids all over the country, so they had to act a certain way, even off the court. One player who really highlights the mental challenges of the game back then was Earl the Pearl Monroe. Now, this guy was one of the flashiest, most exciting players of his generation.
Earl the Pearl Monroe. During an era where the slogan was, do your own thing, Earl was creating it.
But even he struggled with the pressures of the NBA. He's actually spoken openly about feeling depressed at times. He felt isolated and misunderstood. You see, part of it was the trade from the Bullets to the New York Knicks. Moving teams is always a big deal, especially when you're the star. But the bigger issue was the style of play. The Knicks were all about defense and slowing the game down, while Monroe's game was all about flash and fast breaks. That change in style really messed with his head. On top of that, he had some personal issues going on. It was a lot to deal with, and back in the 70s, there weren't the same kind of support system for mental health that players have today. It was a different time, and those struggles weren't always acknowledged or addressed. The NBA wasn't always the harmonious league we see today. In its early days, black players faced a constant uphill battle. Segregation, limited opportunities, and rampant discrimination were the norm. But amidst these challenges, a generation of pioneers emerged, determined to break down these barriers. One name stands above the rest: Bill Russell. He was more than just a basketball legend. He was a symbol of resilience and a champion for civil rights. Russell endured racial slurs and faced discrimination both on and off the court. Yet he led the Boston Celtics to 11 championships, becoming a dominant force in the game. Beyond his basketball prowess, Russell was a vocal advocate for social change. He participated in the civil rights movement, marching alongside Martin Luther King Jr. and supporting other black athletes athletes in their fight for equality. His courage in speaking out against racial injustice made him a role model for countless people. Russell wasn't alone in his fight for equality. Other black players used their platforms to challenge racial injustice. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, born Lou Alcindor, was a vocal critic of social inequality. His conversion to Islam and subsequent name change were powerful statements against oppression. Similarly, Julius Erving, known as Dr. J, used his immense popularity to raise awareness about racial issues. These athletes, among many others, helped shift the narrative and pave the way for future generations. The NBA is more than just a basketball league. It's a reflection of American society, from its humble beginnings to becoming a global phenomenon. The NBA has witnessed tremendous growth and transformation. As the NBA evolves, it's crucial to remember its roots and the sacrifices made by those who came before. The game has the power to unite people, break down barriers, and drive positive change.